Into it. As welcome officially to the session today. My name is Shawn Bravender. I get to be your facilitator for the session. The first part will be a presentation, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions to follow that. I'm from WSP. I'm part of the community engagement team, and I'm joined today by a handful of my colleagues to help support this session and to ensure that everything runs smoothly, as well as we're able to get your input and your thoughts from the academic presentation that will be shared. Next slide, please. So if you experience any technical difficulties, some tips to help are: one, you can adjust your view options, ensuring that you are set to gallery view. Secondly, rejoin using the link in the meeting invite. As well as thirdly, send a message in the chat for technical assistance. And again, we've got my colleagues here that can help support that. We'll run through a brief Zoom overview before we get started today. And if you need to update your name, select the 3 dots and then rename. We'll have cameras and mics off for the initial part of the session today. Only the presenters will be able to use their mics and cameras, but there's still ways for you to participate and engage with the presenters and other attendees. We'll be taking questions throughout the session, and you can post your questions by clicking on the Q&A symbol at the bottom of your screen. Just type in your question and we'll make our best effort to respond to as many questions as possible after the presentation has finished. You also have the option to use the chat box, which is found on the bottom of your screen. And this is where you can post comments and chat with others during the session, but it's not for posting questions to the speakers. We'll be looking specifically at the Q&A box. Also, when you're posting in the chat, make sure that you've selected all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see your comments. Now, this is especially important if you're trying to communicate with other attendees. And just a reminder, if you have a question for a speaker, please post the question in the Q&A box, not the chat box. Thank you. So with that, I will turn over to our president, Cathy Heron, for opening remarks.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm in the same room as Dan Rood and Rachel, so that's why I'm wearing my Princess Leia headphones. But it's really good to see so many people here today. I heard there was around 116 registered attendees, so thank you for your interest. The purpose of this project is really to provide a space for dialogue and informed by independent research on the future of our level of government, municipal government. We can't have a productive dialogue without your active participation, so we appreciate you being here to contribute your feedback and ideas. We are recording this webinar and we'll make it available through our Future of Municipal Government webpage and the weekly newsletter. We also have feedback survey for those who missed the webinar, or if you have any further input to share. I think the deadline is going to be Thursday, June 9th for that. Our friends at WSP will compile the input you provide today, along with what we received through the feedback form, into a What We Heard report, which we will share later this summer or fall for your validation. Next slide. There too. So this is our first webinar on the first research paper of the project, and we're very excited to get things started. Our partners at the School of Public Policy are pulling together an excellent roster of researchers with the academic freedom to dig into a variety of issues impacting municipalities and present to us with facts and ideas. We're starting with Zachary's paper on organizing Canadian local government, as it provides a solid, high-level overview of different government models. It also proposes criteria to help us consider what values we want to see reflected in our municipal government structures and whether our current structures meet those values. Over the next months and year, we will release a series of research papers covering topics shown on this slide. These papers will build on what we are discussing today and further explore factors impact municipal government's ability to support our thriving communities. And that's what we're all here for. Whether you're joining us today as an elected official or an administrator from a city, a county, a summer village, or you work for the province or a municipality related organization, we are confident that what you're going to hear today will motivate you to serve your communities and contribute to positive change. Next slide, please. Thanks. I love the title of this slide. I don't know how we're going to use this acronym, Dan, FOMG or just FOMG, but we had some fun with it today. And so use it freely and get familiar with that acronym, because we're going to be holding webinars to provide feedback, surveys, and release what we heard, report on your reactions to the ideas presented in each paper, which will build towards a President Summit in 2023, where we'll see if we can confirm areas of consensus and then really dig into understanding questions and any disagreements. Yes, I said disagreements. While this project is predicated on the assumption that we all want to contribute to communities that are thriving and resilient well into the future, we do not expect to all agree on how to get there from the start. That's where the dialogue comes in to help move us in the right direction. At the end of the day, we will have a report that will likely include recommendations for the province and even federal government to make changes to municipal policy, legislation, and funding. Then, pending endorsement of the recommendation through convention resolution, the real work begins to pursue implementation. So next slide, please. Through this project, we also have the opportunity to share ideas and solutions. We are community leaders, and despite the challenges facing us, we have the opportunity to see what we can learn from the research along with what we learn from each other, and use our imagination to lend initiatives that benefit our communities regardless of what another level of government does or does not do. As municipal leaders, we make the decisions that impact the day-to-day lives of Albertans. We provide the infrastructure that creates and nurtures communities. How are we going to shape our very own future? Today's webinar provides us the opportunity to discuss that question. I'll be back at the end of the webinar to discuss next steps, but for now, I'll turn things over to Zachary Spicer, or Zach, to talk about his research. One more just to introduce him. So, we're grateful that the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary, which is leading the research aspects of this project, brought Zach on board to contribute, as he is sought after speaker. He's a sought after speaker and researcher on Canadian local governments. Zach is currently an associate professor at York University School of Public Policy and Administration, where he's also affiliated with the Innovation Public Policy Lab, the Laboratory of Local Elections, the Electronic Elections Project, and the Laurier Institute for the Study of Public Opinion and Policy. Obviously, a very qualified researcher. His research on municipalities has been published by the Fraser Institute, the C.D. Howe Institute, among many other well-respected publications. To learn more about Zach, his website is on the slide. So I'm going to pass the baton over to Zach, so take it away.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. It's great to be here. Can we get the next slide up, if you don't mind? Yes, excellent. Here we go. So it's wonderful to see so many people take an interest in this topic and have so many of you here today. We really appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to bring this paper together and to share some of the results with you today. So thank you very much for having me. Can we go to the next slide? Excellent. So what my goal with the paper and with today's talk really is to just kind of give some comparative perspective about the various ways in which we can organize local government here in Canada. What I'm not going to do, and what I didn't do with the paper, is to be sort of overly prescriptive about what you should do. So I'm not here to tell you what you ought to be doing, but just to provide a bit of comparative perspective to sort of spark conversation, allow for some interesting reflection about the best way to organize different communities across the country. What you'll notice in the paper and in today's talk is that there's no right model here, and there really isn't any sort of best way to govern Canadian communities. There's a number of drawbacks with each model. There's a number of benefits. It's really about kind of finding the right fit. So what I'm going to do today is introduce a couple of different models, talk about sort of the underlying logic of each, and give some some frank commentary about where those models work, where they might not work, and some areas in which we might consider as we get into this broader project throughout the next year or so. So can we get the next slide, if you don't mind? Yeah. Thanks. So what I'm going to be talking mostly about today is larger cities. Our research on local government in Canada tends to focus on larger urban centers. I don't think that necessarily means that there aren't insights for those who are governing smaller rural communities. I think there definitely is, but don't be surprised if you see a lot of sort of urban examples in the paper and in today's presentation. But a lot of the sort of thinking about how to best govern regions and how to best govern municipalities stems from the notion that that growth creates a lot of challenges as it moves outwards. So slow, organic, and sometimes fast-paced growth can create a lot of servicing and governance challenges. Can we go to the next slide? And so these sorts of challenges vary. So things like servicing discontinuity, where there's a misalignment between the way that we pay for services, the way that they are delivered, fragmentation. So we get a large metropolitan area with a variety of local governments and service boards and everything else, each with competing jurisdictions or with competing authority. Competition between local governing units, competition for residents, competition for industry and different businesses, and throughout that sort of overlooking at a lot of different regional challenges that these sort of local leaders would be expected to be addressing. And of course, unchecked growth. So growth that isn't really aligned with servicing, isn't really aligned with transportation or movement of people and things. So there's a number of different challenges that come along with that. And we've spent a lot of time in a scholarly context debating about what the best way is to deal with this growth and to deal with some of the problems emanating from it. Can we go to the next slide? So what I want to do first is just sort of run us through a couple of different ways of thinking about regions and thinking about growth. And we'll start with a bit of a throwback to history here, and we'll talk about consolidationism. The guy that you see on the screen here, his name is Luther Gulick. Luther Gulick was a political scientist, but he also was a city manager, including a city manager of New York City for a period of time. But him and his contemporaries looked out at the beginning of the 1900s and saw a lot of kind of somewhat chaotic regions, right? So when you look at places like metropolitan Chicago, you'd see 1,200 local governments, servicing bodies, agencies, each kind of talking past each other, not a lot of coordination happening. Same sort of thing when you looked at the New York City region, Boston, Los Angeles, Detroit. So a lot of large American metropolitan regions were growing. There was a lot of fragmentation within each of these metropolitan areas. So Luther Gulick and guys who thought a lot like him would sort of look out and say, there's a lot of regional problems that are left to fester because local leaders aren't necessarily talking with each other and not incentivized to work together. So things like transportation, right, moving people around the region, environmental degradation, a whole bunch of different challenges that came along with very rapid growth. So the solution for people who think like Luther Gulick at this point in time was that common institutions were needed to bind these regions together, right? So a big, broad regional government, or one large single tier government that would have jurisdictional scope over the entire metropolitan region. That's the way that you bring order to these large, somewhat chaotic places. Next slide. This sort of thinking lasted until about sort of the 1950s, 1960s. I wouldn't say lasted, it's still with us today, but it was popular until about the 1950s and 1960s, when a group of thinkers who prescribed to something called public choice began to see regions very differently. So the people you see on the screen here are Vincent and Eleanor Ostrom. And when they looked at the same sort of regions that someone like Luther Gulick looked at, they say they saw the same amount of fragmentation, but they said this was functional, right? That what you have here is choice, is that you have a lot of ability for residents within this metropolitan area to move around and to find a municipality that suited their needs. So what they call an optimal tax service ratio. And they could say that there are people out there who say, I don't want to pay much of property tax, and I'm willing to not get much service for it. I want a low tax, low service jurisdiction. That's what works for me and works for my family. Inversely, there could be someone else who says, I want high quality public services. I want great recreation facilities. I want fantastic parks. If I see one piece of snow on the ground, I want it picked up right away. Right? I don't want to see cracks in the sidewalk or potholes anywhere. Right? But all that costs money. People say, well, I'm willing to pay for that. Right? Both of those people can find a home in a single metropolitan region if there are a variety of local governments within it. So fragmentation allows for choice. Right? And they say the solution here is little, if any, sort of institutional change. Let the regions do their thing. Fragmentation is functional, and the competition between local governing units only draws out efficiencies, which are ultimately passed along to taxpayers. So they say do nothing. Next slide. A third way of thinking about things emerged about the 1990s and said, well, consolidating things may not be the best way around. But with that said, these purely fragmented metropolitan areas allow for local choice and allow people to find their optimal tax service ratio. But at the same time, we're still letting some of these regional problems fester. So they would say, as opposed to amalgamating some of these regions and consolidating them together, what we can do is create really flexible, problem-centric networks. So servicing bodies, committees, intermunicipal contracting, collaboration, things along those lines, and that we can work together to solve some of those regional challenges, but leave the institutions intact. So this is, I won't say the prevailing way of thinking about regions now, but it's certainly certainly a popular way of thinking about growth and fragmentation within a lot of metropolitan areas. Next slide. So the question, of course, is now we've established the way that the underlying logic of regionalization and metropolitan governance works. How do these ideas work in practice? Next slide. So we're going to look at 3 different models today. I go into detail in each in the paper. So single-tier government, 2-tier government, and something that we call self-organizing mechanisms, which is kind of a fancy term of saying intermunicipal cooperation and collaboration. So we'll go into each today. What I'm going to talk about is the advantages and the disadvantages that we see in past research and we see in different areas across the country. And again, there isn't any sort of right model. There is no right model for you, but each has some inherent benefits and a series of drawbacks, which I think are important to set the table for the future conversation coming up. Next slide. So I'll start with single-tier government, and this is exactly how it sounds like. This is one government for one set geographic area. So within one geographic boundary, there is one service provider, one government, one mayor, one council, and all of the services are delivered to residents within that geographic area by that single government. And of course, here you can see a number of different prominent international examples: Cape Town, Auckland, New York City. So a lot of large international cities use this particular system. Next slide. And with that comes a host of advantages and disadvantages. So the first one here, of course, is that we have a larger tax capacity. So if you have a single tier government over a fairly large geographic area, there's a substantial tax capacity there. They can spend. It's a greater ability to borrow. But what we also have is something called equity in servicing, which means that you can move money around easily, right? So you can use property tax coming from a fairly wealthy corner of town and use it to fund services in the somewhat disadvantaged portion of town, right? Where there may be, communities who are lower income, right? That you can build rec centers and parks and things like that there. So you can move resources around, you can move staff around, you can move servicing pressures around, things along those lines. On the weakness side, there's sort of a weakened incentive for efficiency and responsiveness. You can sort of think of these as monopoly providers. The lack of competition weakens some of the incentives to sort of drive efficiencies. Not to say that councils and mayors within these areas, are sort of disconnected from servicing demands placed upon them from residents, but in certain portions there can be less incentive to sort of fully realize or drive efficiencies, and that the boundaries sort of rarely coincide with the built up economic region. So I'm coming to you from the Greater Toronto Area. I work in Toronto. I live in the surrounding area. The boundaries of the city of Toronto come nowhere close to sort of matching or aligning with the boundaries of what we perceive to be the Greater Toronto Area. So the economic influence of the city spills over its boundaries and carries for a very, very large and carries over a very large area. There's really no way to extend the borders of the city outwards to meet that economic activity. So with that said, you still do have the sort of discontinuities to scale that you may have within a large, very fragmented metropolitan area. Next slide. Two-tier governments is different in the sense that you have two tiers of governments. You have an upper tier and a lower tier of government, and each would take on servicing responsibilities that are aligned with its scope. So upper tier governments, so regional governments, county governments, would generally often look at and address servicing issues on a regional scale. So things like transportation and things that are regional in nature and extend beyond local boundaries. The lower tiers would often take care of local servicing responsibilities. I'm going to show a chart in a second that shows kind of a standard battery of service split between both tiers of governments. But as you can see from some of the examples here, large cities like Tokyo, Seoul, Oslo, Barcelona are using systems like this. So between the two tiers, residents receive a full suite of services. Can we go to the next slide? So a couple of advantages here. The first is that because you can move services between the tiers, you can drive economies of scale, right? You can align service needs with the preferences of residents. So you can move transit down, you can move transit up based upon the demands and preferences of residents and based upon your findings if you're trying to find efficiencies, right? The disadvantages here, of course, that there is the possibility for duplication, right? That you can have two sort of works crews showing up to the same park. We're kind of wondering if this is a regional park or a local park, right? Is this an upper tier road or a lower tier road, right? So there can be some duplication of work happening. These systems to residents can sometimes appear fairly complex and at times somewhat confusing. If your garbage is not picked up and you call the lower tier and they say, well, it's an upper tier responsibility, you may get a little bit frustrated. It can seem like there's a bit of buck passing. These areas tend to have a lot of politicians, so that tends to sort of get people riled up sometimes, thinking who's my counselor, who do I complain to, who do I hold accountable if I don't like some of the decisions and choices being made here, if my garbage is not picked up or my road is not plowed. Who do I talk to? Who's the person in charge, right? So this system can appear complex and can sometimes appear somewhat confusing for those who aren't incredibly familiar with it. And then finally, you can have tension between the tiers, right? That servicing in some cases is a shared responsibility, or one tier may have may sort of take issue with how another tier is delivering a particular service or something along those lines. So you can have personal tensions between counselors and staff and things along those lines, which can sometimes lead to inefficiencies in servicing or just sort of grind work to a halt. So that is possible, and it's possible to have these sort of tensions exist within political or administrative life. Next slide, please. So this kind of shows a standard setup of how you may organize one of these two-tier systems in terms of servicing, again, all of this is somewhat flexible, right? You can sort of move an upper tier service to a lower tier category and vice versa. But this is sort of what you would typically see. And because of time, I'm not going to go through every single category here, but I thought it might be helpful to sort of highlight two of the services here to kind of demonstrate where servicing may lie or maybe best positioned between tiers. So let's look at fire and police services. So on the police side, generally criminals don't tend to sort of respect local boundaries too well. So crime may be committed in one lower tier, and the suspect may have to be pursued to another or something along those lines. So this provides a larger jurisdictional scope for police to pursue crime. Police services often also need specialized equipment or specialized teams. You can think of things like emergency response teams, SWAT teams, and then different investigative units. So homicide investigative units, sexual assault investigative units, things like that, right? Thankfully, those may not be used on a daily basis by any means, but the police service has to have them. So having them at the regional level provides them for them. It also provides for a larger jurisdictional scope. On the other side, fire, right? Fire, aside from from wildfires or bushfires, tends to be quite localized in structural fires and things along those lines. So having each community have their own fire service is much more efficient, given that there's often specialty in equipment, right? So a rural community may not necessarily need a pumper truck that can put out a fire in a 10 or 20-story building, right? That may not necessarily be something that community needs, but something that a more built-up urban area might, right? So so making sure that those rural communities don't necessarily need to pay for very specialized equipment for structures that they don't even have, drives efficiencies and economies of scale, and allows for local responsiveness, knowing that there's a local fire service who will always be there. So just looking at the chat, there's a fire service that will always be around the community and able to respond to fires. Can we go to the next slide? And one of the questions that I often get is sort of how do you move from a two-tier system to a single-tier system? I think this is important to point out, and I've detailed some of this in the paper. What I wanted to highlight in the presentation today is a couple of high-level things, just given that we're somewhat tight on time. But I encourage you to sort of read the section of the paper as well. Okay, thank you, Sarah. There's a couple ways to do this, either annexation or amalgamation. Annexation, you're simply moving boundaries out. Amalgamation, you're talking about mergers. So there are some examples of voluntary amalgamations and voluntary annexations across Canada. For the most part, we tend to see involuntary amalgamations, so ones that are done by the province. So Winnipeg, Toronto, Montreal, and Quebec City are somewhat leading examples of this. What we've seen evaluating some of these projects is that there tends to be not a lot of cost savings, and that consolidation tends to sort of lead to increases in servicing costs. You do get some of the advantages of running a single tier government, in the sense that you can move money around. You can better provide for service equity within the actual community itself, but you tend to not see the savings that you would expect. And part of this, as I've detailed in a couple of other papers and highlighted in this one as well, is the process of amalgamation. It tends to be quite quick, and there isn't really a lot of time to sort of think deliberately about where you might realize savings. So they tend to be kind of like shotgun marriages, right? They happen quickly with participants who weren't fully invested. And so the process tends to happen quickly, which tends to sort of sap any of the sort of initial cost savings that you might realize. And of course, when you amalgamate, you sort of weaken some of the incentives that you would draw from cooperation. Next slide. So one of the highlights, self-organizing mechanisms. So these are ways that you can sort of tap into that new regionalism thinking about emphasizing governance over governments. These are contracts that communities can sort of enter into themselves without the province. They can share servicing. I've seen examples of sharing the cost of creating recreation centers or libraries, to emergency management agreements, cost sharing for 911, cost sharing of staff, having one CAO for 2 municipalities or the same treasurer or something along those lines. So there's a variety of service areas and a variety of sort of internal processes that could be shared, that could be contracted from one to another. And there's a number of examples across Canada. There's thousands of different agreements across the country. Next slide. And we can see a number of advantages here, right? The first is that there's really no institutional changes needed. You don't need to amalgamate. You don't need to annex. You don't need to de-amalgamate. The province doesn't need to sort of make any sort of institutional changes. The provinces often don't know how many of these agreements actually exist. I would hazard a guess that most provinces have no interest in actually knowing how many of these agreements exist out there. So they can happen organically, they can happen voluntarily, they can happen without the provinces getting involved. They can be service and term specific, so you don't need to sort of work on a variety of different services. You can work on one. If you're having a problem with transportation or road maintenance or something along those lines, it could be service specific. It could be for 1 year, 2 years, 10 years. And the past research has shown that for the most part, these agreements realize cost savings. So they tend to work out quite well under certain circumstances. Some of the disadvantages, of course, that these agreements can be unstable. So meaning that you get a change in council, and they may want to cancel the agreement. The services may not be delivered at a quality that the residents want. You may be locked in. You may want to kind of cancel or terminate. There's a number of different ways in which these types of agreements can just simply be unstable. They can be difficult to form in some instances. It starts with basic, just talking and seeing where some commonalities lie, but actually working through some of the legal aspects may be challenging, and the transaction costs of actually forming some of these agreements can go up quite quickly. So sometimes people just simply walk away from them. And the last point here, that it's difficult to achieve regional continuity, that this kind of provides for a weak form of regionalism, given that that there's a really kind of one-off servicing. Can we go to the next slide? And I'll explain a little bit more about that. So I know this slide's probably a little bit challenging to see. This is a service sharing network map from the Greater Toronto Area. So thicker lines and sort of more sort of densely clustered cities means that there are more agreements and more sustained relationships over a longer period of time. So again, I know this is kind of hard to see, but this is basically showing that there are geographic clusters throughout the Greater Toronto area, as you might expect. Neighbors tend to work with neighbors, but there's also areas that choose to not cooperate with anyone at all. So the municipalities at the top, the ones who are a little bit more of a distance away from some of the core service sharing relationships, they tend to not want to work together, right? So you can't compel them to work together, given that these are voluntary mechanisms. So it may not provide for a really solid foundation of regionalism that some may have hoped. Next slide. So in the paper, I provide sort of quick comparison and analysis of each of these systems using a standard battery of economic criteria. So efficiency, economies of scale, externalities, both positive and negative. So where we have spillover effects over boundaries, and equity and access. Can we go to the next slide? And where I kind of show some of this analysis. So so go through this briefly. Just, I know I'm running a little bit short on time here, but in terms of single tier systems, they tend to score quite highly on things like equity and access and accountability, right? So you have the ability to move resources around, to move money around, to sort of improve servicing in other areas that may not have been able to sort of realize service improvements if it weren't for a single tier model. The access and accountability tends to be high as well, because there's a direct relationship between residents and those who they elect, right? If something goes wrong, the garbage is not picked up, the plow hasn't come yet, you know your counselor, you know the phone number of City Hall, you can call them up and you can see what is going on. So you can hold decision makers to account because there's more of a direct relationship with them. The two-tier models tend to score a bit higher on efficiencies and economies of scale, given that that you're essentially able to move services up or down to really realize some of these efficiencies and realize economies of scale. They tend to not score as highly on equity and access and accountability, primarily because these systems have more than one set of decision makers, right? That there is the ability to sort of move money around in a two-tier system at the regional level, but there is some resource lock-in happening at the lower tier level, right? So some of those resources aren't mobile in the same way as they would be in a single tier system. Access and accountability tends to be slightly lower as well, because some of these systems, there could be two different tiers of decision makers. You may not necessarily know who you're calling if you have a complaint, or you may not know how to assign responsibility for service deficiencies, or who to sort of reward if things go really well at election time, right? That it requires a higher level of knowledge on the part of residents to really hold decision makers to account. Self-organizing systems tend to be quite low on equity and access and accountability, given that some of the decisions being made about the service areas are happening by decision makers outside of their community. So if it's two governments coming together to say maybe jointly create a recreation center or something along those lines, the construction and the operation of that facility is not within the hands of one set of decision makers, right? That there's two councils involved, right? And that residents of one community can't really hold councilors in another accountable in the same way. Equity is quite low, given that these tend to be service specific and tend to not sort of deal with the revenue side, but given that they are service specific, they tend to score a little bit higher on things like economies of scale and efficiency. Can we go to the final slide? So aside from these sort of standard economic criteria for evaluating governance models, there is a number of other considerations to sort of take into account. Some of these can be a little bit more subjective, right? And I lay these out fully in the paper with a number of questions that local decision makers may want to think about as they're evaluating different models and evaluating the fit, seeing what might work well for their own communities, right? So things like local identity, right? That what does amalgamating into a single tier government mean for local identities and local communities and value systems and beliefs, right? Right, thinking about how the formation of new governments may affect the composition of the community or the governance structure, or some of the longer term financing options for that particular government, right? I mentioned that that the speed of amalgamation in some parts of the country has dampened any sort of cost savings. So the way that we form governments, the way that we transition between governance models matters. So thinking about whether we want that process to be fast or slow or happen over a certain period of time, that stuff matters, right? Administration, who's going to be in charge, right? How does the relationship between staff and council work, and how do we want that to be that to be structured, right? So there is a lot of other considerations that are needed before transitioning or entering into any sort of new governance or servicing model. I lay those out a little bit more detail in the paper, given I'm a little bit short on time today. I'll let you read all of that, but this is just to show that it's not all about things like efficiencies and economies of scale. There's residents involved here. There's ways of life involved here. There's local identities involved here. There's other things that that should be taken into account as well. And again, ultimately, the future of these communities are in the hands of those who live there. And there is no one single right model. There's advantages and disadvantages of each. But with that said, these are your communities, right? And the government's model should fit for you. So with that, I will stop right there, and I'll turn it over to Shawn. I think we'll enter into some questions if anyone has any.
Thanks, Zach. Appreciate that. So we have the opportunity for you folks to ask questions along the bottom of your screen. In most cases, depending upon your setup, your computer, but you'll see a Q&A box. If you click on that, then you can input questions that we can get the right person on the panelist team to respond to, whether it be Zach or Rachel or Cathy or another. So while you're accessing that, Cathy, do you want to turn your mic back on? I believe you have a question for Zach, and we'll start with you.
Yes, thank you. I can't actually post in the Q&A because I'm a panelist, so thanks for allowing me to leave my role as president, just think as a mayor for a second. So Zach, awesome, by the way, awesome presentation, and the paper was great too. My curiosity has always been about these two-tier levels of government. I've talked to Ontario councillors, and I find it interesting, and I feel like it works in many ways. So I'm curious how they're funded. So does the lower tier collect property taxes and then shares with the upper tier, or vice versa? Or do they each individually have their own powers to somehow collect property taxes, or is there another way of funding them?
Mm-hmm. So out here in Ontario, they each have the power to tax residents, right? So generally, they can each do their own individual remittances, but generally you would receive one tax bill. So usually that would come from the upper tier government, and there would be a remittance from the region to each of the lower tiers. So each would independently set the tax rate, but you would typically receive one tax bill. And for us in Ontario as well, there's the education portion as well. So that which is funded, which is a separate line on your property tax bill. So you would kind of get all three, and you would remit to sort of one source.
Okay, that's it. And then how about voting? Like, so you go to the polls and you vote for your local and then your regional representative. Yeah.
Yeah, so so the ballots can get a little bit long, but yeah, you would vote for. So there's a number of different ways that you can do that. So certain counties are set up in a way. Certain counties are set up in a way where the lower tier councillors will sit on upper tier council as well. So you can have. So sometimes, depending on the county, it is the mayor. Like the mayor and the deputy mayor also sit on county council or something along those lines, right? Some regions will have an elected chair. Sometimes it's appointed. Some people will elect. So sometimes you can elect your regional councillors and your local councillors. In some cases, you vote for those who are local and regional. So there's a number of different ways in which it can be done. But typically, you have a choice of you are aware that you are electing someone to sit on more than one council as well. And I see. Yeah, sorry. So Elmosh is in the audience, and he's keeping me honest here. I had it mixed up. It's the lower tiers that would collect and remit, not the region. So thank you for that. Almost spent many years working for the province of Ontario, so he definitely knows for sure. So apologies for that.
Thanks, Zach. We've got a couple of questions coming through the Q&A, but Rachel, I believe you had one. Do we want to go to that one next, and then we'll jump to them as they're populating?
Sure, and I have others. So if people don't jump in, they're going to have to listen to my questions. Although I'm glad to see that we have a few popping in now. But Zach, I'm just curious. I know, in Alberta we have intermunicipal collaboration frameworks that municipalities have just worked really hard on. So I'm glad to hear that these collaboration frameworks do have savings. I think a lot of people will be relieved to hear that. But my question is about the access and accountability piece in terms of intermunicipal collaboration. And I know, those kind of score lower when it comes to that, but I'm curious if you've seen anybody, if you've seen any innovative solutions to kind of address that issue and improve access and accountability when you have greater cooperation.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. So I think there's a couple of things happening here. So first, on the access and accountability side, so access matters, right? So I think that one thing that is common with a lot of these agreements is that they technically don't, they're not usually public, right? So most residents out here in Ontario tend to not know, where these agreements are or what services are being shared between which governments. And to be frank, I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily care, to be entirely honest, right? I go to the sink, I turn the water on, the water comes out. I don't really care if it's coming from Toronto or from Ajax or some other place, right? So I don't know if there's a burning desire to see these agreements, but I think municipalities would, can improve things on the access side if they made them accessible, right? And sort of made them public and let people know that, we're in a joint boundary road maintenance agreement with municipality X, Y, or Z. I think that would certainly help, that people can see the terms, conditions, they can see what one municipality is paying for another, and what the responsibility for each is, so that they can, they can hold decision makers to account, right? On the accountability side, I think that that the structure of these agreements matters as well. Like, these are, for the most part, legal documents. There's a very small subset of these that are kind of handshake agreements that are very informal, that aren't really written down. Those are very hard to track, given that they just aren't written down, right? That you can have agreements between staff or between council that have existed for years and years and years. They're very informal. The overall trend is to formalize these, codify them, make them legal. And so there's different ways in which these agreements can be structured to hold different partners to account, through increasing penalties for missing servicing deadlines or something along those lines, having termination clauses, penalty clauses, things along those lines that would allow one municipality to terminate the agreements if the terms and conditions weren't lived up to, or if there's just really not meeting resident preference. So I think the contracts themselves can be kind of looked at, firmed up, and that they could be made accessible to let residents know, where the servicing is coming from and how much money is really being saved.
Right. Thanks, Zach. Well, let's go to the first question in the chat here, or pardon me, in the Q&A. It's from Bill, and he asks, did Ontario have independent incorporated rural municipalities prior to establishing two-tier government? And Zach, I believe you may be the best one to speak to that.
Yes. So we've in Ontario, we've always sort of had district governments, county governments. They've been with us for a very, very long time. So it's kind of this sort of traditional organizing unit of local governments here in Ontario. So even when we look back to Upper Canada, Lower Canada, we had districts that were mostly used to sort of to organize militias and militarily and things along those lines. So it's sort of the other way around. We had sort of big, broad districts that turned into kind of counties that developed lower tiers over time. as places within these counties urbanized, the urban sections were separated when they reached a certain population threshold, which was for the most part around 10,000 residents. They were politically and administratively separated, even though they were socially and economically connected. And then some of these really faster growing regions were converted into regional governments, which saw a lot of amalgamations of the lower tiers and the reintegration of the separated cities back in. So to answer Bill's question, we sort of did things in kind of a reverse way, but these places did exist independently. So hope that answers Bill's question, but let me know if it didn't, Bill.
Thanks, Zach. Next question. Thank you for the presentation. I appreciate reading the paper. Academics prefer to operate within the Starbucks regions. Most municipalities operate in the Tim Hortons regions. And in brackets, they state, I might suggest that most of the municipalities in the province do not have a Tim Hortons, close bracket. Agreed on the concepts about what the impact of the ag societies and other cultural groups and Part 9 companies on the type of government in a location. So for Al, I'm not sure if that statement or if there's a question that we need to extract out of that. If you could clarify, and Rachel, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll maybe just jump in because I think Al raises a good point. And Zach, feel free to add to my statement. I think, this is kind of the first kind of foundational paper drawing on Zach's expertise in terms of the research that's out there to date. But that's part of the opportunity and purpose of this project is through some of the other papers, we'll be able to go that step deeper, and through your engagement, go that step deeper as well into those smaller municipalities. And I know from conversations that Zach and I have had, and that Zach has had with some folks, he's been interested in following what's happening in Alberta and happening in time in sort of those smaller areas. And I hope that this is a real opportunity for smaller communities to get some attention from the academic community and draw the interest of research, as well as even in your own words, in your own experience, sharing what's happening and sharing with each other ideas, concepts, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it is a past challenge, but also an opportunity.
Sure, and I would just sort of add to that. Certainly, I think that's a fair point, right? A lot of us are operating at universities and cities. I think there is an interest in what's happening in rural Canada. And I think for a lot of us who have spent some time trying to evaluate different transitions to different models, the government out here in Ontario. So when we study amalgamation, of course, a lot of us look at Toronto and Hamilton and some in Ottawa, some of the larger cities. Most of the amalgamations happened in parts of rural Ontario. So most of the governments that were consolidated were outside of the largest cities, right? So we begun to sort of look at that, right, and looking at what some of the effects are, not just from a financial point of view. We see very, very similar trends, that there wasn't a lot of cost savings, servicing costs generally increased, but looking at how this affected culture, right, how this affected relationships between, different communities that didn't have a lot of connections between each other for a lot of their history, right? And now, especially in Ontario, a lot of these areas are experiencing tremendous growth pressure, right? That now that they have larger governments, in some cases they've lost some of the control over this sort of development, the sort of growth that can be accommodated there. So I think there is a lot more. There is a lot more work to be done on how rural culture and rural values affected by institutional change. So point taken, now. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Next question. As we see provincial and federal governments slashing funding to municipalities and citizens still requiring the same level of services without driving taxes into the stratosphere, do you think we'll see more municipalities looking at the self-organization option? Will this be the only way for small municipalities to survive?
I appreciate that. I would start by saying that self-organizing models aren't necessarily, right for everyone, given that, sometimes you just can't find the right service to sort of cooperate on. Everything is kind of running fine, right? So, but with that said, I think there's always conversations to be had. And I think that, where we've seen intermunicipal cooperation and service sharing, we've generally found cost savings, right? That it generally brings costs down. Where we get into some interesting aspects about sustainability, in smaller communities is when you start thinking about sharing staff. So across Northern Ontario, there's a lot of smaller towns that are geographically large, meaning that they probably wouldn't be good candidates to sort of share wastewater systems and stuff like that, because the settlement areas are just so far apart, right? They wouldn't be good candidates to share perhaps like a library or a recreation facility, because residents would be driving 40 plus minutes both ways or something along those lines. But they're really great candidates for sharing a CAO or a treasurer or a legal team or an IT team or something along those lines, given that a lot of them have trouble attracting talents and finding the right candidates for certain jobs, stuff like that. And so some of them are finding really creative ways to have a CAO work 3 days in one place, 2 days in another, or to have a legal team that is, where you're pooling resources between them. They're sharing integrity commissioners and stuff like that. So I think that there's a lot of creative ways that you can enter into service and staff sharing arrangements that can, that are pathways, to sustain smaller communities, right, and sort of help them through times where there may be sort of fiscal challenges or something along those lines. So I think provinces are looking to for communities to be innovative in a certain sense, in that try something, and we'll come in if we're sort of needed, right? So I think you're right on that point, Chris. I hope that my answer has been somewhat helpful to you.
Great, thank you. Next question. How is experience with separate corporate entity for specific services like recreation facility, which you just referred to, Zach, in a region between multiple lower tier? Thanks.
How's experience with separate corporate entity for specific service like recreation? Okay, so yeah, so we're thinking between two tiers of government. I'm just trying to make sure I'm understanding the question correctly. But as I almost mentioned here in the chat, so saying Ontario recreation is generally a local responsibility, next separate tier facilities would probably be a fee-based, residents can preference access. Yeah, so I think from a two-tier system, this is I much kind of answered this. So there would be kind of a fee-based system for use if there isn't some other financial arrangement between the two tiers, right? So I think that's important. If there is some sort of interlocal agreement or something like that, there usually is some sort of financial arrangement where there's a cost sharing arrangement or there's service sharing or something along those lines as well. So hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Next question. Given that there are two levels of governments and we are a ward of the province, has there been academic research on the preferences of the province in relation to this topic?
Yeah, so I think that's a very interesting question. So I think the preferences of the province, I think, depend on who is running the province at the time. I think different governments of different stripes can have very different goals when it comes to the local government sector. I think typically a kind of broad goal is that the sector would be sustainable financially, that it would be administered competently, and that the province wouldn't have to sort of deal with a lot of political spillover and things along those lines. With that said, we've seen certain provincial governments become a little more activist in this area and sort of drive personal agendas into sort of how they think the local government sector should be should be run, right? So for us in Ontario, a case went right to the Supreme Court about how the province got involved and reduced the size of Toronto's council, right? And that, I think, can be directly attributed to the preference of the premier of the day, right? I think there are also a ton of sort of unintended consequences as well with some of these different initiatives. So amalgamation here in Ontario, we went from about 800 municipalities to 444. So pretty sizable shift and change, and that was because one provincial government felt that there was inefficiencies in having so many governments, and so amalgamation was seen as a way to save costs. That never really materialized. But what other provincial governments have sort of dealt with since is that by amalgamating so many governments, is that you now are dealing with larger and more powerful intergovernmental actors. So there are fewer municipalities across the province of Ontario, but they speak for larger populations, and politically they carry a lot more weight. So I think this is somewhat of an unintended consequence. But I think generally what provincial governments are looking for is financial sustainability and competent administration. Hope that answers your question now.
Thanks, Zach. Next question. Has there been any research into understanding whether citizens understand or agree with the fragmentation of public service delivery at the local and regional level, and how that affects the organization of local governments? A recent social media chatter suggests that citizens do not support or understand how services are delivered and billed in the utilities world. For example, why are there so many riders and fixed charges by so many entities on my electricity or natural gas bill?
That's an interesting question. So, there's many research on understanding, it says understand or agree with the fragmentation of public service delivery at the local level and how that affects the organization of local government. So, yeah, I think generally, residents tend to not sort of think on a day-to-day basis about the organization of government. I think, as long as things work well, people tend to sort of not think really about how they're delivered. I think everyone here knows that the delivering governance of our communities is quite a complex task. But I think where people run into sort of get frustrated with fragmentation and in sort of certain areas is where there's sort of persistent policy challenges that can't seem to be solved, right? So you have a very big expansive area and just like transit just doesn't work. So I'm thinking, why can't I take the bus from municipality A to municipality B? Why is this still out there? Why is this not working, right? And it's those interjurisdictional issues that people just can't seem to understand, right? Taxpayers, they seem to to sort of think like, why can't you just get together and solve these problems, right? We understand that that the answers aren't necessarily easy to come by, but for a lot of people, they ought to be, right? So I think that there has been a lot of research into sort of understanding how citizens perceive fragmentation, but certainly I can see a lot of sort of frustration when the rubber meets the road, so to speak, and there's a lot of sort of service delays or service deficiencies or something along those lines.
Thank you. That's all the questions we have for now. Rachel, did you have one last one, or shall we transition to the next steps?
I think we can transition to the next steps. That's great. I think, lots of this we can consider as just a first step. And I think there's lots of conversation to come and lots of dialogue that we could have about the opportunity. And maybe actually I will ask just this one question. So we focus a lot on the outcome of forced amalgamation and how that hasn't had the benefits. But when amalgamation has been thoughtful of two parties that have kind of decided, like, we really see the benefit and will come together, and I know we have some examples in Alberta, has the research parsed into that difference in outcomes of forced versus voluntary amalgamations?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. So there has been some research done into voluntary amalgamations. The thing about voluntary amalgamations versus involuntary is it always depends on the reason why you're doing it, right? And so I think the process here matters, right? So when the province tells you, you two are now going to merge, you're going to become one, right? There's from the people who are then sort of the when you become one, it's that we make the order, but locally you have to sort it out. So the hard work of becoming one rests on the shoulders of local politicians and staff who, are obviously quite frightful about what this means for their professional futures, what this means for them personally, and so you have to sort of work through that as well as you're trying to sort of work on a process that may eliminate your job or something along those lines, right? When you come together voluntarily, there's a little more buy-in. There's generally, there's generally community support. I know that Ted put up a example in the Q&A, which I definitely appreciate, Ted. But there's generally is some sort of community support, so people want to see this, and the reasons could vary, right? Even you say, we're not going to find cost savings, but we're not after that. We're coming together because we feel it's the right thing to do. We feel that, we feel like one community. We always have, and, we hope to sort of continue and as one community, right? So I think the process matters. The reasons why you come together matter. I think even if you have a involuntary amalgamation, if you set a period of 24 months or something to sort of really kind of work through and figure out who's going to be employed here, what capital infrastructure do we need, what can we sell off, and figuring out a new procurement process and stuff like that, you can realize some cost savings from that if the process is long enough and works well, right? So I think the reasons why you're coming together matters, and how you do it matters. So hope that helps someone.
Great, thanks, Zach. We can go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to launch a poll right now. It's 3 quick clicks of your mouse, just to give us an indication of the actual format of the session, how well it works, not on the material. And I'll get to that when we conclude this evaluation poll. So we'll give this a minute or two to ensure everyone has an opportunity to give us their feedback.
Shawn, one thing I realized we forgot to do was have voting music. I know we talked about it before. We forgot to actually do it. And I would, of course, chosen the song Connor McDavid by Edmonton's former poet laureate, Cadence Weapon, because it would have been a great anthem for going into tonight's game. I realize it might have alienated half our listening audience, but just so everybody knows that would have been my song choice.
Okay, thanks, Rachel.
Our member, you might not be aware, Shawn and Zach, our members have gotten used to songs accompanying questions that we have during our resolution session, and now it comes as a demand now sometimes.
Do you have a poll question about who's going to win the game tonight?
Ooh, people can put their comments in the chat, but let's keep things respectful, folks.
Well, and looking at the feedback we're receiving on this evaluation poll, for our participants and attendees, if there's anything that you really like about the session or anything you think we really need to improve, please feel free to put it in the Q&A, and we'll review that. And sure, as we go forward, we want to ensure that we're making the best use of your time, both in the technical support and the format that we can. And that is the purpose of these 3 questions, to give us a bit of a litmus test on what's working well and what we can tweak to improve and enhance your experience. So I think there's another minute or two. Looks like we got about 38 people responded, and I think there's probably a potential of about 50 plus that are participating with us today. So if you haven't had a chance, you can just give us a quick indication on these 3 questions here about the format of the session today. Well, we'll leave this poll open, but let me jump on to something certainly more pertinent to the topic today. And you see in the slide here, the session evaluation poll, that's what we're completing right now. And then the research feedback form. And so that is something that will take a little bit more time, but that input will be directly infused into the work that Rachel is leading and that the School of Public Policy is supporting, and that the engaged team that I'm part of from WSP will be able to help coordinate on that. And that feedback form link has actually just been dropped into the chat. There were some questions in the chat about this presentation being available after, and that certainly is the case. It is being recorded, and we'll be able to provide that to you shortly there after the session concludes today. So with that, I think I just want to express my appreciation as the session facilitator. One, for the support of Sarah and Megan and Brittany from the Engage team that have helped provide all the technical background and layout and so forth for this, but especially to you folks for participating, your comments, your time and your thought processes, and look forward to working with you going ahead on this project. With that, I will back down a little bit, back off the mic, and turn it over to Cathy to close us off. Thank you.
Thanks, Shawn. So thanks everyone, honestly, for your engaging in the conversation today. Some really good questions. As I mentioned this just before, many of the research, this is informing dialogue, which is really the key to what we're trying to do at Alberta Municipalities, is create that dialogue. And on that note, the second paper on our future, the FOMG series, it will be on population growth and population aging in Alberta municipalities. That's going to be released next week. And we're going to hold a webinar to discuss that paper on June 20th. So mark your calendars. Registration information will be provided in next week's weekly newsletter. And then, of course, one of my favorite activities to while away Alberta's long summer evenings is reading on my patio while sipping a nice, cool beverage. So I'm eagerly awaiting the release of the third paper on municipal finance, or financing municipal infrastructure. Nothing says hot summer reading like charts and graphs on municipal financing trends. I hope you all agree. We're going to be doing a webinar on that one in the fall, so just stay tuned to the digest for more information on that one. Next slide. So I also, want to just, when we have your attention, mention some of the other upcoming events that we're hosting. So Municipal Leaders Caucus is coming in June in 4 different locations across Alberta, where we'll discuss topics that dovetail nicely with our future municipal government work, including local government fiscal framework and creating more positive political culture at the local level. And of course, Alberta Municipalities Annual Convention is always a highlight of my year, and I can't wait until we can all get together in person in Calgary in September to participate in stellar education sessions, networking with colleagues from across the province and provincial officials, and vote on a meaty resolution. So I've heard we have at least 15 in the queue already. So we'll be sending out information on that. You should note that the resolution deadline is May 31st. So if you're not putting the finishing touches on your resolutions, what can I say? You might have to wait till next year. And I think that's my last slide, is it not? So just thank you. Yes, thank you for your time. I brought my hat to wear today, but I didn't wear it because I didn't want to play favorites because this is a cross-province webinar. But I will say go Oilers go. And Rachel, on theme songs, I Googled it on my phone. So this is my theme song for tonight. Play La Bomba, baby. Good way to end the session. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone, and best of luck to your team of choice tonight.